Trauma podcast. I am so excited to have this chat. And I'd love to just start by letting you tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot I could say or not say, but I mean, I guess I would say that my name is Thais. I've been in the field of educating people both in private practice and then through our online programs, educating people about the subconscious mind and attachment styles, and most specifically, something called integrated attachment theory, which is the science and sort of trademark techniques of how we can actually change our attachment style. And I've been in this field and doing this work for over 10 years, coming up on 12 years now. And I definitely got into this field of work because I had a lot of my own attachment style work to do. I was a fearful avoidant attachment style. I grew up in a very chaotic home and household. And I think I really started at quite a young age trying to understand myself and my own patterns. So I started off in the traditional sort of school system, doing an undergrad in psych, and then eventually really moved into a space of trying to understand more about hypnotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, neurolinguistic programming, a lot of the techniques and modalities that have to focus us on our subconscious mind. And the reason I found that to be extremely valuable is because number one, our conscious mind is responsible for roughly 3 to 5% of all of our beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and actions. And our sub and unconscious mind collectively are responsible for 95 to 97% of everything. So a lot of our patterns that we're experiencing really exist at the subconscious level of mind. And a lot of our traditional system, although this is starting to change a little bit more, very recently, a lot of the traditional system is really conscious mind focused. It's all about how can we do talk therapy or, psychoanalytical work. And that can really help us understand ourselves better and self-observe, but it doesn't necessarily help us repattern, really create these deep shifts and changes in our patterns, in our unhealthy behaviors, in the way that we show up in relationships, in our fears that we're carrying at a deep level. If somebody fears being abandoned or trapped or betrayed, based on their attachment style, understanding that is great, but it can easily just become this label that we attach to unless we're really doing the work to recondition these things. So a lot of the work I focus on has to do with the subconscious mind, how we can really recondition our patterns efficiently. And it's a big passion of mine for sure.
That's amazing. And we will definitely touch on your amazing work in a little bit. But I just want to ask and just go a little bit deeper into your experience as a fearful avoidant. Because I love to hear about you and your story and what made you, do what you do now and that passion.
Yeah, so I guess with being mindful of my family and respecting their stuff as well, at a very high level, I just went through a lot of attachment trauma growing up. So I just had a ton of chaos in my home, a lot of big ups and downs, a lot of issues specifically around trust, broken trust in a lot of ways, boundary violations, all kinds of stuff. There was
Yeah.
just a tremendous amount of chaos. And there was so much of it that as a young adult, the idea or concept of being able to trust people or even think that people are looking out for your best interest, or even thinking that when you care about somebody in a relationship that they will communicate openly or be honest with you or things like that, those were such fractured concepts for me. So I really went into a lot of my relationships in life. I wanted love, and I had some really good moments with love. Very typical of fearful avoidant. You kind of have these extremes, right? Some really
Yeah.
good experiences and some really terrifying ones. And so I wanted love. I wanted connection. I really cared about connecting with people, and I wanted depth and intimacy. And I didn't really ever do well with superficial things, but as soon as I would form those bonds and actually connect that way to people, I would become terrified. So I would find myself all of a sudden really needing to push away, shutting down, thinking, I definitely carry this deep subconscious belief that everybody will betray you and abandon you eventually. So kind of what's the point of connecting? And as soon as I would fall in love in romantic relationships, I always experienced it as sort of this bittersweetness. And what I mean by that is the more I would feel in a relationship, the more I would also experience this weird pain around it. Oh, now that I care so much, it's going to hurt even more when everything inevitably falls apart. And so as soon as I would start to develop feelings, I would experience constant flip-flopping in relationships. I would be one week I would be like all in and be like, I'm so happy about this. And another week I would be like, can this really work? Like, this is going to be really hurt me eventually. And I would be in my mind, like, should I stay or should I go? Should I stay or should I go? Just on such a regular basis. And I had a hard time really letting people in. I could connect deeply to people's experience, but I probably seemed vulnerable on the outside, but I wasn't really being vulnerable about the things that were truly vulnerable to me. And so I would share things at sort of a deep level, but never anything that I actually felt vulnerable about. I really had big walls up. And so I struggled a lot in relationships all through my early adolescence. And I honestly found relationships to be very exhausting as a result.
Wow, I love that you're sharing this. I used to have an anxious attachment style, and I've been in a relationship with a fearful avoidant attachment style. So I love hearing it from your perspective of that, and yeah, I'm sure my listeners will love that too. What were I mean, it sounds so scary to think that you were, one week in and then one week out. And I can only imagine the turmoil. I know as an anxious attachment style, the turmoil we go through in our minds. But to realize that you were also going through that is really incredible to hear. So what were like the shifts that you had to take to to overcome that for yourself personally?
Yeah, there was a lot of big things I focus on, and hopefully this can also help people kind of on their own journey, because this is what I find to be the most streamlined version of how we heal at this point. So, the first thing is that I had a lot of what we call core wounds in a relationship. Now, core wounds originally come or have a lot of their basis in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is something I spent a lot of time doing. But CBT kind of has limitations in the fact that it tends to target the conscious mind. And it can be a really valuable tool because like our beliefs and thoughts have a huge impact on how we view the world, how we view ourselves, how we view things like relationships. But unless we can actually rewire these patterns and these ideas, then it can be hard to really build momentum. So a big first focus that I dove into is because I was learning about things from a hypnotherapy perspective and doing work in CBT at the same time. I learned to merge those two things together. And my own early work became, how do I rewire or recondition these core fears that I have? So some big fears I had as a fearful avoidant were things like, I will be betrayed. I will be abandoned. So you, as a fearful avoidant, you definitely have that anxious side. I can very much relate to like what it means to be anxiously attached, because you have those moments, but then you also have these very avoidant moments, and you're sort of polarized at each extreme. And so I had some big core wounds around, I'll be abandoned, alone, trapped, betrayed, helpless, powerless if I rely on other people. I mean, I had such a huge fear of ever building dependency on somebody else and needing to like rely on them. That was just something that like absolutely terrified me to my core, because as a child, when you had to rely on caregivers, and if there was a lot of instability in that or chaos in that, it's like, oh my gosh, God forbid I have to, in any point in my life, like rely on somebody again and then be trapped in a space where I can't get my needs met, or they come with all these stipulations, or there's a lot of ups and downs. That just was something I never wanted to relive. And so a big, huge first part of my focus became reconditioning these core wounds, because what I realized is like, just because that was my experience doesn't mean that that's an accurate depiction of everybody else's experience or how everybody else is going to be. And I made a really clear decision that I didn't want to be somebody who lived my life assuming that everything was my past, and reprogramming those core wounds and really doing the work on them. And I'm happy to like share a tool at the end, but doing that work was so healing. I like, it was incredible for me. And the biggest thing was that my mind throughout the day used to be so focused on like, what I call projecting our core wounds. Because once we have these fears, we project them onto everything, right? Imagine you like see a bear in the woods and you run away, and the next day you're back in the woods. You're projecting, oh my God, could the bear be here? Is the bear going to come get me again? And our mind does this to keep us safe. Yeah. But when we're doing this in everyday experiences and relationships, it's exhausting, and it doesn't really do that much good for us. And so I went from experiencing chaos in my mind, constantly being in fear or distress or assuming the worst of people, and having such a busy mind, to, after doing that reprogramming work, like feeling the sense of stillness and space, which in turn allowed me to stop surviving every day, like just focusing on perceived threats and trying to defend myself against them. And instead actually thriving in the world, having space to create, having space to build, to have healthy relationships, to go after my goals and my career dreams, and all these things that followed. So reprogramming core wounds was a huge number one. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I could go on for a very long time about this, but then at a very short level, the next thing I learned to do was figure out what my needs were as a person. And my really focusing on my relationship needs and really using that information to build a relationship to myself. So when I learned my own needs and how to meet them, especially when I did that repeatedly, for enough time that it actually conditioned my subconscious mind, that really helped me with my own self-soothing. And then I felt like I didn't have to, project these fears for my core wounds, and I didn't have to panic if somebody wasn't there for me and experience that more anxious side of my style. I could self-soothe. And the third major thing for myself was learning to regulate my nervous system. I did a lot of somatic work. I went through the whole somatic experiencing certification route and learned a lot about that. And that was the internal work to myself. And then with others, I eventually learned how to communicate my boundaries and how to communicate my needs to other people so that I could have that healthy sense of interaction with others. So those are the 5 main things that I would say at a high level I really dove into.
Amazing. And I'm curious, did you ever experience a relationship with an anxious attachment style at the same time? And if so, I'd love to know like what that felt like for you on the other side.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did. Yeah, I did. One of my first, I mean, I was young and but it was like a serious relationship for me. Like it was the first year of university. Um and he like lived with me for part of the summer at one point. It was like for 3 months. It was just while we were waiting out at school. Um but yeah, I would say that was like a serious relationship for me at the time. He was a really good person, and like he just meant so well in the relationship, and there were so many like great things about him. And for me, honestly, I just couldn't accept that level of care or stability. So for me, it like there was this deep sense honestly of feeling like an unworthiness around it, like this deep sense of like I'm not worthy of being loved like this. I am unworthy is also a big core wound of fearful avoidant, but there's a lot of the research I do, like our subconscious mind forms a comfort zone from our attachment styles, experiences from childhood, and so we'll tend to try to reinforce that comfort zone. So we'll tend to, because basically the subconscious mind sees what's familiar as safe, and thus we're more likely to survive. So for me, here was this person who was like really loving, really showed up, had his life together, and here was me who was like in chaos and hadn't done the inner work yet. And I just like felt this sense of restlessness and like boredom around being loved like that, because I think at a deeper level, my familiar zone was craving chaos, because that was what I knew. And so I felt like unworthy. I felt like, oh, he's going to sort of find me out, that I'm not like worthy of being loved. And so it's going to hurt anyway. So I would always keep him at arm's length. He would try to like do a lot of things to keep getting closer and making an effort in the relationship. And that would overwhelm me for sure at times too, because I just didn't really have this regulated sense of self. And the big thing was for sure, I would feel like I couldn't allow myself to really be open to receiving that amount of care or kindness, because I think my subconscious mind was just really rejecting it. Like, oh yeah, here's somebody who's showing up, but like, this isn't how people really are. And even though it's so funny, he's a really good person, and probably like such a loyal person in all of his relationships throughout his whole life. For me, I had such a big belief that like all men betray women. And it's something that I've worked on so much and definitely do not feel at all now. But at that point in my life, I really believed that. So it was like, well, why am I going to let someone in when they're just going to betray me eventually? Like, what would be the point of doing that? And so, yeah, I felt like I had really positive moments with that, but I spent a lot of time like kind of trying to run or push it away. And that's how I overall describe that experience.
And then that would trigger the anxious attachment style, which would then try and close that gap, and then it would push you away even more. And that's where it's a tricky dynamic.
Definitely. And I was on a podcast once with Mel Robbins, and she said something and it like always stuck with me. It was such a good question. She was like, "Oh, it sounds like a dismissive avoidant pulls away and a fearful avoidant pushes away." And that is like just on the money, and it's so true. And that was something that I really did. So I wouldn't just pull away. I would actively push away. Like I would do things that were
Mm,
trying to break that relationship down. Like I would do things to sabotage it a little bit. Like,
really?
um, yeah, like try to like cause stress to the, it wasn't conscious, of course. Like I wasn't like
Mm,
waking up in the morning, like, how am I going to sabotage this relationship? But it was like this emotional turmoil I was experiencing around closeness was like too much. And so I would, try to like make excuses to spend less time together. And I would try to say things that I thought were going to push him away, or just
yeah.
things that pose this like, yeah, the relationship probably won't work out long term anyways, things like that that are like, yeah, I feel so bad now, like, after doing all this work and looking back, 15 years later.
Yeah.
But looking back on that period of time, it was like I can see now how I just felt like love and closeness was threatening. And as
Mm.
much as I wanted it and like cared about it and valued it, I just really also had all these underlying fears around it. And so I would go out of my way to just make sure that it was never going to be too close, because that was a subconscious strategy for self-protection.
Yeah, and I get it. And an anxious attachment style is doing the exact same thing. So it's just, unfortunately,
Yes,
they're just doing it a different
exactly.
way, and then it creates that
Exactly.
tension. So it's totally the same, and it's amazing to hear from the other side even more in depth. Um, what would you say to somebody that was anxious that might be in a relationship with a fearful avoidant? What would you say? Is there anything that you think they could do? And it's very difficult if somebody has an anxious attachment style and hasn't done the work and they're very triggered, as you know. But is there anything you could say from your side of experiencing that would help or provide them some kind of soothingness in the situation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of really great things that can help the relationship along a lot.
Mm.
Um, and I also, at the same time, want to be mindful, just to preface it by saying that anxious attachment styles, because they're so loving and because also their way of soothing is to try to make
Yeah.
sure that the other person's okay and the relationship is okay. I'll definitely give some advice and tools, but just please, for anybody listening, make sure it's not at the expense of yourself. Because sometimes it can be like, oh, I have all these tools and resources for how to fix the other person and soothe the other
Yeah.
person. But a lot of like what will truly impact the relationship is the anxious attachment style, learning how to regulate their own nervous system, meet their own needs, recondition their own core wounds, and really soothe
Definitely.
themselves, which will allow them to more effectively hold space for somebody else. So that's obviously the real work, but
Hmm.
some really helpful things are, when I was fearful avoidant, I did not know how to communicate at all. Like, and it's hilarious because like that's, and I've been married now for a few years, and I've been with my husband in total for like almost 10 years. And it's funny to think back on this time of my life now, because he and I like communicate so openly and transparently. But before I really did a lot of that work and dove into these things, I did not know how to communicate for the life of me. So what would happen all the time as a fearful avoidant is, let's say like something made me feel insecure. And it could be anything. It didn't have to be like the typical things. It could be like that the person was in a bad mood, and I would go, oh, well, see, the relationship can't last because people get into bad moods. Like I would just, always see it all from my worst case scenario fears. But as soon as
Yeah.
something would bother me, I would stuff it right down and I would stew about it. And I would never, ever tell the person what I was actually upset about. So, what would happen is, something would stress me out. Or let's even say like the person didn't call me back. Like, let's say back when I was dating an anxious attachment style and he was really great about communication, but let's say there was like some kind of change in the pattern, I would notice it. And then I would never address it. I would brew my own insecurities and stories around it. And I would tell myself, oh, look, all the reasons that the relationship's not going to last, or look, all the reasons I am unworthy of love and connection. And then I would hold that right in. And then, like 3 hours later, because I could only hold it in for so long, I would pick a fight about something totally unrelated. And it was almost like that emotional energy had to go somewhere because I was stressed. And so it would be about something silly because I didn't know how to be vulnerable about what was actually affecting me, and it felt
Hmm.
too unsafe to do so. And so, something that was so meaningful for me once I did that inner work first, my own core wounds, meet my own needs, regulate my own nervous system. That was great. But something that was so meaningful for me being in relationship later in life, when I had, started to really go down healing my own attachment style and becoming securely attached, was learning to actually address the things that bothered me. And when a fearful avoidant communicates their needs, that emotional energy gets to go somewhere productive. So for me, I can remember with my husband, when we were first dating and I was supposed to pick him up, he like had to take his car in. I was supposed to pick him up from somewhere, and I was rushing. I had somewhere else to be afterwards, and I was kind of going, I was going to pick him up, drop him off. I had somewhere else to be right afterwards for something work related. And I, was on a tight timeline. I didn't communicate ahead of time that I was on a tight timeline enough. And I didn't communicate that I was already stressed about it enough. I picked him up. He was super late. He didn't answer my first 2 calls either. And I usually don't like call people more than once in a row. So I already felt like, oh, I'm double calling him. And this is me at the time, just being like funny about stuff. But he didn't answer the first time. I waited for like 5-10 minutes. I called him again. And then he didn't answer. And then I sent him a text. I'm like, I have to leave here. Like, I won't be able to pick you up unless you come out in the next like minute or so. Anyways, he got into the that he was like, oh, sorry, my phone was on silent, and made no big deal of it. And for me, I was fuming. Like, I was so mad. And I remember that it was so hard for me to say, hey, I'm experiencing feeling like you're not valuing my time. And it's causing me to feel disrespected. And I really don't like that. And I would always just get angry in the past, say you don't care, just say something like that. And I remember realizing because this was the first time I was dating after being really single for a while and doing a lot of inner work. And I remember realizing me talking like that is not effective. So I'm going to have to try to be vulnerable. And I remember feeling so terrified, in fact, that I can remember the color of shirt that I was wearing almost 10 years later, because it was this very vivid experience, because it was so visceral. And I remember saying, hey, I feel hurt because I, was in a rush. Maybe I didn't tell you how much I was in a rush and how important this next commitment is for me, but I'm experiencing it as you're not respecting me or my time when I'm kind of going out of my way for you. And that can't happen again. And I also need to know that you actually do respect my time. And I communicated like that. And I remember just feeling dread, nails on a chalkboard. I can't believe I just said that so vulnerably. And his response was oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I totally get why you would feel like that. I will never do that again. I will go out of my way. I'll be better with my phone. I'm so sorry. And I remember feeling all this emotional energy that was this turmoil of disrespect or whatever, core wounds that I hadn't worked on yet that were coming up. I remember thinking oh my gosh, that was so much more effective. That was so much better for me than what I would normally do. And it was that point forward that led me into wow, I really just want to do that all the time. And I learned to become good at communicating vulnerably. And that allowed me, anytime I was hurt or stressed or frustrated, to make these conflicts into solvable problems with him. And that was something he showed up really well for as well. So obviously you need a little bit of both there. But I would say if you are anxious and you are telling somebody, or you're trying to be there for somebody, tell your fearful avoidant loved one to communicate openly. And when they do communicate about what they're experiencing, be validating. Say I get why you feel like that. I understand where you're coming from. And then, hey, how do we create a solution to prevent this from happening in the future? And that will positively reinforce the fearful avoidance so much, because they deeply yearn to feel seen and heard, to feel like they can communicate more. And that will take all this relationship turmoil that feels like an unsolvable problem and turn it into something that actually feels solvable.
Yes. Is your husband now, is he a secure attachment?
Yeah, he's secure now. I know you asked about you asked from anxious, and I was talking about my ex who was anxious from years and years ago, but
Yeah.
he was actually probably at least dominantly dismissive avoidant when I met my husband.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, and he definitely he had a lot of childhood things that really line up with that too, and he definitely had a lot of the dismissive avoidant traits, but I think we were both in a place in our lives where we were doing the work inwardly first. And so he had a lot of things to show up for too, just like I did. And we really did the work together. And so, if you told me 15 years ago I'd be in a relationship like this, I'd be there's no freaking way. But we are so secure and so peaceful. And it came from doing the heavy lifting over time. Like for sure, we've been in a really great space for the last 5 years, but we had a power struggle stage. We had things to work out over the years earlier on. Like it
Mm.
wasn't like just simple and straightforward, but we were both willing to show up for it. And I really believe that kind of work is so worth it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's so interesting hearing you tell that story. It's so similar to what an anxious attachment style experiences as well. I think where they have build resentment within them because they're giving so much and then they don't say it and then they explode as well, or they become passive aggressive, or and it's interesting because when I was in that relationship with the fearful avoidant, I had no idea I had an anxious attachment style, and I had no idea he had a fearful. I had no idea about attachment styles then. If I knew now, it'd be a very different story. But that was exactly the experience of, like, they wouldn't say anything and then something would happen and then suddenly there was a whole list of things I'd done wrong that apparently that come from nowhere. And I used to be like, I'm quite a direct person, so I was like, what, how could I ever know, and hearing you say this now, I can understand that actually it was just self-sabotage from their part, but I couldn't understand that then. And because I had no idea, and I was so triggered because I had no idea what was going on. And hearing you say now that actually they only want to feel seen and heard and safe, I wasn't able to do that back then because I hadn't done the work. But it's amazing to hear it from the other side of, wow, we're actually really similar. It's just that they didn't show it enough. Whereas an anxious person can be a bit more, you know, outwardly with their anxiety and their triggers. A fearful avoidant tends to shut down more and doesn't feel safe to be vulnerable, like you said. So it's so interesting hearing it from your perspective. And I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Do you experience any of these things now, today?
I want to be so careful not to paint this picture of like perfectionism and
Yeah.
stuff for people because that's never the goal. Um, and it's not like this overnight process for people. Healing's going to have like ups and downs. I'm like 10 years almost into a relationship. And so there's different stages of a relationship. There's the
Mm.
dating, the honeymoon, the power struggle, and then you go into the stability, commitment, and bliss stage. I'm definitely in the bliss stage of my relationship. So to be perfectly honest, like I wouldn't say I can think of a time in like years that I've had like a fearful
Yeah.
avoidant experience at all. But I just want to be careful not to, when people are earlier in different stages and keep in mind too, like I do this work all the time and I've been doing the
Yeah.
work for a long time and my husband really, really shows up well for stuff too. So yeah, I definitely feel like I'm like really, really securely attached with like no like fearful avoidant edges or no, I don't think I have like a secondary attachment style at this point. But just for
Yeah.
anybody listening, like that comes with work, that comes with time, that comes with investment. You even could be somebody who's like securely attached and earned secure, but then you go through the power struggle stage and you may have little behaviors that come up then. And,
Mm.
I'm not perfect. I still have like times where I'll have like an unmet need and I'll feel, a little frustrated, like, oh, this need isn't met, but I'll talk about it. My behaviors to approach that are really healthy and secure. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely don't have any fearful avoidant left in me at this point. Um, I wish I could give like a good example of something, but
No.
I still like, I'm still a
Yeah.
human being, I still have days where I get like, my dog right now
Yeah.
has brain cancer and like, I'll cry some days, I'll be
Oh.
sad over it. Like which doesn't mean you're
Yeah.
like a robot, but yeah, you do the work and the work will change you for sure.
Yeah, and I always think, even when these things do come up, and your attachment style impacts every aspect of your life. It impacts business, it impacts money, it impacts every relationship. So it's not just romantic anyway. So it can always come up, but you know exactly what to do to work through it. So I think it's a very different thing from when you're first realizing it and you're uncovering it and doing all the work. So that's fantastic. That makes sense. And just to preface that, a secure person still might have a need that is unmet for them, that they have to bring up in a
Exactly.
relationship. Like, that's very normal. And, conflict is normal. Discussing things are, things, it's very normal as a secure person.
Exactly.
It's not to be a robot. It's just not to allow it to, you know, trigger you and control you, essentially. You want to learn how to manage it, and that's the key.
Exactly. And how you approach it will really be key, right? So, like, if I were to say back when I was fearful avoidant, if I had like a need that was unmet, I would for sure tell some kind of story around it. Like, oh, the person doesn't care. That's why they don't meet the need. So it's never going to work anyway. So I should shut down. Like I would have a whole narrative around it. And then I would hardly ever, if ever at all, communicate the need directly. I would usually get upset about something else because I couldn't be vulnerable about the thing that was actually bothering me, because it felt too vulnerable and too real for me. And then I would feel dysregulated and it would affect me for days, and I would, have chaos in the relationship. Whereas now, if there's like an unmet need, I'll like realize it, I'll honor it, like I'll really validate, like, oh yeah, this is a fair, healthy need. And I will go and I will address it directly and negotiate it. And if somebody in a relationship, like my spouse, my husband, he's really good. Like he'll meet the need. We'll find a way to figure it out. Like that's an easy thing. But let's say it's somebody like at work or somebody I don't know as well, for example, in those particular cases, then, I'll really advocate for the need and see it through. I'll really try to like make sure that the person understands me, and I'll even use like asking for empathy statements like, hey, could you see why this would be important to me? And if somebody doesn't meet the need or doesn't show up, I'll reconsider like my level of relationship with them. Like maybe we're not as close as I thought if this is a really important need to me. And if the person's not willing to do that work with me the way I might be for them, then maybe I'll take a little step back in the relationship and honor my boundaries, So you'll still be a person, you'll still have different dynamics, but your way of handling things will be what really makes all of the difference overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Your response to everything. That makes sense. Amazing. So in your opinion, can different attachment styles, can they work together? Can they have a healthy relationship?
In my opinion, yes. I mean, it's a resounding yes for me. Again, I'm biased because that was me and my husband. And I was working with clients in client practice. Even through when we started the personal development school, the first few years, I was still seeing clients. And like, that's the area I would specialize in, is people of different attachment styles, being able to heal, do the work to become securely attached together. And so I'm a big believer in that. I'm a big believer in, if we target the subconscious mind specifically, we can recondition and rewire a lot of, like, you're not born with an attachment style. These behaviors and ideas get conditioned into you because of your early upbringing and experiences. And there's a lot of really easy ways that we can recondition these patterns. And so I'm very biased in that, but the one caveat to all of this is both people have to be willing to do the work. And the work doesn't have to look the same. Like for me, when I was doing the work, it was like reading books, taking certifications, doing the work on myself, applying reprogramming tools. For my husband, we would talk about stuff and he would show up and communicate differently, and he would put in the effort to change the behavior. And he wasn't like reading books. He read a couple books and stuff, but he wasn't like taking certifications and like working with clients and like in the field that I was in. But he was willing to match my effort. He was willing to like show up, make an effort, try to change things. So the work doesn't have to look the same, but you have to see very clearly that both people are applying themselves to try to really move the needle around those unhealthy behaviors in a relationship.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I say. If both are willing to do the work, it can definitely work. However, anxious attachment style tend to be fixers and savers and caretakers, as I'm sure you're aware. And sometimes there can be that need to, and I've definitely done this, to try and get people to do the work that are not perhaps ready to do that. So what would you say to anyone that might be in that position where they might, be with another attachment style that is a little bit more reluctant, and sometimes that can be the more avoidant attachment styles, to face those kind of things?
Yeah, great question. Number one is, sometimes if you're anxiously attached, you will do a lot of self-sacrificing behavior. So you will put other people ahead of yourself and your own healing. So like the one thing, whenever I would work with anxiously attached clients, or when anxious attachment styles come into our programs, I am like, hold on a second. As much as there's the impulse to fix the other person, put the work into yourself, at least equal to how much effort you're applying to the relationship. And I don't say that because it's like, oh, anxious attachment styles have so much work to do. Like, it's not coming from that space. It's coming from that the more you do that inner work and can regulate yourself and release these core wounds by reprogramming them and meet your own needs and self-soothe, the easier it will be for you to then see the relationship so clearly and decide what's next. And then the second thing that I always advise is, when you talk about doing the work with somebody or you're trying to fix somebody, it's great to share with them about attachment styles and what you know. Usually most avoidant attachment styles will not respond well to you telling them what their attachment style is. So you can say, I'm learning about the attachment styles. Here's the 4 of them. Here's what they are. Which one do you think you are? And you can ask them rather than tell them. And then have a two-way conversation where you say, look, these are some things I'm going to work on. Here's some things that, I think would be really useful if you could show up for in the relationship, meeting these needs of mine, or, communicating differently. And some big things that are great to ask for are, more consistency in communication. If somebody has to cancel or change plans, to explain why, and to do that with validation and reassurance, and to do things where somebody's able to be more present in the relationship and make you feel seen and heard. And those are great requests to put out. And then what we do, and I always advise this for everybody, you set a deadline. So if you're somebody who, like, you realize you're dating somebody else of a different attachment style, you're doing the inner work, you're showing up, you're telling them what you need so that there's no guessing games or reading between the lines, and you're really intentional about that. Then what you get to do is watch and see if, when you communicate your needs and you show up to let a person know, do they meet them? Do they show up to do the work with you? And I often advise setting that deadline in relationship to your pre-existing investment in the relationship. So for example, if you've been dating somebody for 6 years, then your deadline is probably going to be, hey, let's work on this really hard for 6 months. If you've been dating somebody for 6 months, your deadline may not be another 6 months. You might be like, you know what, I'm going to try for 2 months to really see if we can, get this moving in the right direction. So you set a period of time where you are going to pour in. You are going to pour into yourself first. You're going to pour into the relationship second, by honoring your needs, communicating, making an effort to communicate based on how that person, receives information and what their fears and triggers are. And you can take all of that into consideration. And then at the end of the deadline, when that time comes, you're going to know, did we grow together, or did this make no difference? And if, you basically position yourself for a win-win, because either you did a ton of work on yourself and you practice all these tools for a relationship and how to communicate to people differently and honor your needs and see them through. And that's a win for you no matter what, because you grew and you're going to be better off for your future relationships. Or and maybe you're in that place, the person didn't grow and show up. Okay, that's fine. I can let it go, but I grew. Or best case scenario, you both grow together and it's tremendously meaningful for both of you at the same time.
Yeah. And for anyone listening, that obviously, even hearing that is like, when thinking about being in that situation, when you haven't done the work, the idea of setting a deadline and actually leaving is like horrendous for an anxious attachment style. But what I do want to say is, like, what you're saying is true. Once you're doing the work, that gets a lot easier to honor that within yourself. So anyone listening, I get it. Like, it would feel too much to do that, but once you're doing the work, you can do that, and that is a healthy way to do that. So that's fantastic.
There's this old story. If I can tell a story really quickly.
Please.
There's this old story, and it's in this book called The Mastery of Love. And it's the same author that wrote the 4 Agreements. It's like a super easy read. And the author talks about, and I'll probably butcher the story because I read this like 10 years ago, but it's a great story. The key takeaways I'll get right. And so the author talks about in this book how, imagine you have a magical kitchen, and somebody comes into your magical kitchen, and you can snap your fingers and you can have whatever you want. You can make a pizza, you can make a chocolate cake, whatever you want. Your magical kitchen produces everything. And one day somebody comes and they knock on your door and they say, hey, I have a whole pizza here for you, and I'll give it to you, but in return, you have to do all these things that I tell you to do. So it comes with all these stipulations. Well, because you are overflowing with all the food you could ever need in your magical kitchen, you're like, I don't need your pizza with a whole bunch of stipulations. Like, I can snap my fingers and have my own pizza. And then the story goes on that the magical kitchen breaks down, and the person hasn't had any food for 3 days. They don't know how to cook food or prepare food because, they've always had a magical kitchen that just worked. And then somebody comes back and they knock on your door and they say, I have a pizza, and it comes with all these stipulations attached. And because you are starving, you're probably likely to put up with a whole bunch of their BS because you are starving for food. And the analogy of the whole story talks about like really anxious attachment styles. It doesn't talk about anxious attachment styles specifically, but like that's, the analogy we can pull from. It's like an anxious attachment style when you are starving for love because you are not loving yourself, because you are busy abandoning yourself to please other people, putting yourself last on the totem pole, never meeting your own needs because you want other people to meet them. And so you don't get that opportunity to build the muscle to properly self-soothe.
Yeah.
When you're always relying on what's outside of you, it comes with all these stipulations. But instead, if you can start getting into relationship to self and doing that inner work, you're actually going to build such a deep sense of self-love and self-connection that your standards will change. What you're willing to accept outside of you will change. And you will get to a point where you feel confident and comfortable enough to honor what's not working and to be able to say, you know what, this isn't fair to me. I'm not being loved in the way that I need. So let me take a different look or a different approach to this instead of just going through the same motions in a relationship that I'm feeling unhappy in, where the other person's not willing to show up with me. And then all of a sudden I find myself years down the line, maybe that person left anyways because they weren't trying to show up and put in the work. And now I'm starting fresh instead of being like, you know what? I'm loving myself. My confidence is better. My self-esteem has improved. And now I can see this person's not going to do the work. They're not going to change. I'm going to honor that I deserve more. And then maybe it hurts a little bit because the breakup will, but I can also do the work to heal through that. And then I'm going to be on the lookout and only accepting of people who are truly going to meet my needs so I can actually have a satisfying relationship going forward.
Yeah, I love that. And just for anyone listening, you actually do have a choice. That was something that was so foreign to me, the idea of that I would have a choice to be able to like leave and do that. But you actually really do have a choice. You don't have to accept those breadcrumbs. So I love that. And you're totally right. So just finally, I know that in your book, Learning Love, you talk about the subconscious mind, reprogram the subconscious mind, which I fully believe in and is exactly how I have overcome my anxious attachment style. But I'd love to just hear from you, your perspective on how that can help you change your attachment style.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that any change that we want to have has to be ingrained at the subconscious level. So that was like my big, push around this. Is there's a lot of wonderful work out there about attachment theory and like the 4 attachment styles, but like there was a very minimal work on how we can actually change to become secure. And so everything that I teach, everything we talk about in our programs is all specifically to target the subconscious mind, because unless we're doing that work, in my opinion, it's not that meaningful. And so I'm glad to hear that you're like on that same page.
Definitely.
Now, I could tell you all kinds of different tools for how to reprogram the subconscious mind, but maybe I'll just share one because it can sort of leave everybody with a good tool to start off with. But I focus on 5 main pillars when it comes to reconditioning our attachment style, similar to the ones that I shared. So reprogram your core wounds, learn to meet your needs. And we actually do that in a way that's subconscious. So we naturally start to self-soothe and it's ingrained into us. Learn to communicate those needs. Again, leveraging principles of how we get reconditioned. So communication becomes our new normal and it feels easy to communicate and we have the proper tools to do so. And then making sure we regulate our nervous system, again, repeatedly enough that it's habituated, it's subconscious, our nervous system changes and we stay in rest and digest more. We're less in sympathetic or fight and flight mode. And then we set boundaries. And again, we do this through exposure work consistently so that we can actually make this our new normal and boundaries come, naturally in real time. So there's tools for each one of those. There's multiple tools for each one. They sometimes work better for different attachment styles, but I'll share one that's a great universal tool for everybody, and it's called autosuggestion. This is a tool I really believe in. It's kind of rooted in an overlap of cognitive behavioral therapy and hypnotherapy. So it's really about like understanding our core wounds and how we can recondition them at the subconscious level, leveraging something that's known as suggestibility. So number one, there's 3 steps. There's kind of like 4 steps. So the first step is we have to get into a suggestible state. So suggestible states are usually when our brain is producing more alpha brain waves. And if you've ever seen somebody, like who is under a state of, or like in a state of hypnosis, they are, their brain waves are changed. And even like hypnotherapists will give like specific scripts and say certain things to put them into a relaxed state and give them different cues that are more likely to stimulate alpha brainwave production. And so, we want to make sure that we're in that space. Some things we can do to engage alpha brainwave production are, number 1, meditate. do some sort of light exercise or mindfulness practice, anything that's like getting us into a more relaxed state. But generally the first hour that we wake up and the last hour before we go to bed, as long as we're not drinking coffee, we're more likely to produce alpha brainwaves. So step one is like get yourself into a relaxed state, or just do this tool first thing when you wake up before you drink coffee, because then you are already in a more suggestible space. Number two, we want to find this big core wound or core fear that we have and its opposite. So just for like argument's sake, to keep it super simple, if somebody has this big core belief that like I'm not good enough or I'm unlovable, like what are the opposites? I'm lovable, I'm good enough. So we want to find that. Step three is I'm not a believer in affirmations, because to me, affirmations are your conscious mind speaking to your conscious mind. And these core wounds, these big fears, they are not conscious. Like, as somebody who's had a lot of them, I can tell you, I did not wake up every day and be like, I'm going to tell myself all day long that I'm not good enough and I'm unworthy and see how I feel. Like, these were not conscious choices. They were pre-existing, habituated subconscious programs from painful and unresolved past experiences. So we have to actually target the subconscious. And affirmations, the reason they only target the conscious mind is because your conscious mind speaks language. Your subconscious mind speaks in emotions and imagery. So if we want to speak to our subconscious mind, we need to speak in emotions and images. So how do we do that? Well, every single memory we have is actually a set of emotions and images. So if I were to say, tell me your favorite childhood memory, and it was you playing in the playground with your friends, you would actually see the images of the slide. And we've all seen people, when they tell an old memory or an old story, they laugh or they smile or they tell the story and they still giggle about it, because all memories actually have the emotion intact. So what we do in this third step, right? So we get into a suggestible state, we find our core wound and its opposite. And let's say it's I'm not good enough, I am good enough. Step three is we come up with 10 memories of times we actually did feel good enough. They don't have to be huge. They don't have to be like these huge accolades or awards. They can be little teeny tiny things. Like, I was a great friend yesterday when somebody needed me. I showed up really well as a parent 2 weeks ago when my child needed me to be present. Like, just these very specific things. And when we have 10 of them, it's repetition, and it's repetition and an emotion that actually fire and wire new neural pathways. So now we've got 10, and step 4 becomes I need to record them down, and I need to listen back to these things for 21 days. Because when I listen back for 21 days and I really feel about these experiences, and I really see the images, well, now I'm like engaging my subconscious mind in this process, and research into neuroplasticity shows it takes at least that 21-day period to really build neural networks that are strong enough that they're going to stick. And so in summary, get into a suggestible state, find the opposite of your core wound, find 10 pieces of memory to support this new idea that I am in fact good enough, and listen back to the recording of this for 21 days. It takes 2 minutes a day. And I promise if you stick to it, you will see massive transformation in a very short period of time. And it's like so worthwhile, because if you've ever felt like I'll be abandoned, or I'm not good enough, or I'll be alone, or unworthy, or trapped, or powerless, or all these really painful core wounds, they friggin' suck. They ruin, they sabotage relationships. They ruin your mood. Like, when they come up, they're the triggers that hurt us, and they don't have to be that way. So as long as we target them there, we can really see a lot of transformation.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that, and totally agree that would massively help. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've enjoyed everything. I will leave your where to find you in the bio, but if you'd like to share how we can connect with you, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so I put daily content out on YouTube, which is at Personal Development School, dash Thais Gibson, so THAIS. But if you just type in Personal Development School, it will come up. And then I am on Instagram at the Personal Development School. And I have a website called personaldevelopmentschool.com, where people can get like a free attachment style report that goes in detail with like their core wounds and tools and all that good stuff as well. And we run a whole bunch of different course programs through there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.